Hello and welcome to the first virtual roundtable session of ICAF 2020's virtual conference programming, From Gender and Violence to Cyborgs and Selfhood, Feminist Discourses in Female-Led Superhero Comics. I'm your host, Biz Neidham, former secretary and now treasurer for the International Comic Arts Forum's Executive Committee, and it is my pleasure to open this evening's event. Due to COVID-19, the International Comic Arts Forum's 2020 conference, to be held concurrently with the Small Press Expo just outside of Washington, D.C., was canceled. However, we have reimagined a way for accepted ICAF panelists to make their contribution to ICAF and have organized a series of online events to achieve ICAF's mission of celebrating comics through scholarship. Over the next several months, ICAF will host monthly virtual panels and roundtables alongside a series of weekly blog posts featuring accepted ICAF presentations. All panelists who are accepted to ICAF 2020 have been welcome to participate in our online programming with the intention of curating monthly virtual events around specific themes. Please see ICAF's website for more information on our upcoming events, as well as for the pre-recorded talks from our panel of roundtable participants and links to their presentation transcripts. It's been a pleasure to organize this roundtable event series with ICAF Program Director Frank Bramlett, and we would like to express our gratitude to the other members of the ICAF's Executive Committee for their support. More importantly, however, we'd like to thank today's panelists, Susan Kirtley, Carolyn Cocca, and SamLangsdale, for giving us the opportunity to have such a rich conversation about their work. Finally, we'd also like to thank today's moderator, ICAF's own Emily Decker-Bess, for facilitating this conversation. Emily Decker-Bess has been fundraising coordinator on the ICAF Executive Committee since 2019. Her previous professional experience includes working at Marvel and in development in museums. She has written for online blogs such as The Rumpus, presented on numerous panels, including at Rutgers and C2E2, and has given lectures on her research at various schools and institutions, such as the Field Museum. Today, she works at SCAD Libraries as a global librarian, while she continues to research and lecture on the feminist movement in comic art. But before we begin our roundtable session, a note on the technical side of this Zoom webinar event. First of all, this event is being recorded and will be posted online on the ICAF website after its conclusion. We are also leaving the chat function on so that members of the webinar are able to discuss the presentations or communicate with me regarding issues. However, I will be moderating the chat, and I ask that all conversation be thoughtful and respectful, as well as mindful of how excessive chatting can be distracting for all participants in today's webinar. Soon after the panelists have given a short summary of their research, we will open the floor for questions. Please submit all questions via the Q&A function, which you will find at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible within the time available to us, though we apologize in advance if we're not able to address all inquiries. We are grateful that we can provide free access to our conference events this year, but if you're able, we would welcome small donations through our PayPal account to help support the costs of hosting our online programming. You can find the button to donate at the bottom of the ICAF homepage, which is located at www.internationalcomicartsforum.org. Thank you again to everybody for helping to make tonight's event happen. So without further ado, I'll let our moderator take the lead in introducing our roundtable participants. Thank you. Emily, on to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Biz. All right, our first panelist of the night is Susan Kirtley. She's a professor of English and the director of comic study at Portland State University. Her research interests include visual rhetoric and graphic narratives, and she has published pieces on comics for popular press and academic journals. She is the author of the Eisner-winning Linda Berry, Girlhood Through the Looking Glass, co-editor of With Great Power Comes Great Pedagogy, Teaching, Learning, and Comics, and the forthcoming Typical Girls, The Rhetoric of Womanhood in Comic Strips. She is currently an associate editor of Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society. Our second panelist is Carolyn Cocca. Carolyn Cocca is a professor of politics, economics, and law at the State University of New York College at Old Westbury. She is the author of Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, Militarism and Feminism in Comics and Film, and the Eisner Award winning Superwoman, Gender, Power, and Representation. She is also the author of Jailbait, The Politics of Statutory Rape Laws in the United States, and the editor of Adolescent Sexuality, and teaches US politics, constitutional law, and gender studies. Our third panelist is Sam Langsdale. Sam Langsdale is a senior lecturer in philosophy and religion at the University of North Texas. Her research and teaching interests include feminist philosophy, visual culture studies, contemporary critical theory, and pop culture studies. Her work explores the politics around the representation of gender, race, and sexuality in visual culture. Her recent publications include an article in Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, as well as chapters in edited volumes, Comics and Sacred Texts, Reimagining Religion and Graphic Narratives, and Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. She is also the co-editor of the volume Monstrous Women in Comics, published by the University Press of Mississippi. I'll let our panelists take over and give a 5-minute summary from their virtual presentations, which can also be found on the International Comics Art Forum website. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the folks at ICAF for organizing this. It's really lovely, and thanks to my fellow panelists. My project is, it's sort of a small project that might become a larger one, and I made notes about what to say for the abstract because I've kind of forgotten how to talk to people because I'm teaching all asynchronously online virtually, and I don't interact much, so I've sort of forgotten how to speak coherently, so I had to take some notes. So this is very exciting for me to see people. Yeah, exactly. So my project, it's sort of a new one. It's called Girl in the Middle, Cyborg, Selfhood, and Ms. Marvel. So I'm a super fan of the original series Ms. Marvel, and I was really curious to see how her journey would continue in the new incarnation, The Magnificent Ms. Marvel, which debuted in March 2019. In reading the new series, I was struck by the idea that this new approach sheds some of the playful tone of the original, pointing to an altered direction and a new maturity for our hero. In The Magnificent Ms. Marvel faces fiercer villains and difficult crises, even as she encounters these numerous physical and philosophical contact zones. And these conflicts play out particularly spectacularly when she finds herself split in two, becoming this human girl and the cyborg, Ms. Marvel and Storm Ranger. So my presentation explores this moment of division and transformation as the character inhabits these liminal spaces. She's enacting a vision of girlhood in conflict, and she's poised in this contested space or spaces between girl and woman, violence and mercy, and emotion and logic. And so I'm looking at particularly at Storm Ranger and this sort of contact zone and these moments of transformation and these threshold moments for our character. So that's kind of the space that I'm in and what I'm talking about. Yeah, and so I don't know who wants to take it over next.
All right, I think our next one is Carolyn, if you don't mind.
Sure. I also had to write some things down, so for the same reasons. But basically, the way I'm talking about gender and violence is the ways in which some readers and viewers find female superhero violence pleasurable because it feels empowering and it subverts dominant cultural narratives of gender. But in some ways, I'm more interested in how, for others, for whom that subversion of gender norms is kind of discomfiting, female superheroes' violence is made more palatable in different ways. And so in this paper, I kind of talk about 4 ways, although I'm really more focused on one than the other 3. So the 4 ways are how stories conform them to race and class notions of gender performance, present these women as naturalized to violence because they were born to a violent, exoticized monoculture, accentuate their similarities to popular male superheroes, and surround them with military tropes and trappings. So for Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, their modern comics especially, the subversion of gender norms is attracting a more progressive audience, but the containment of that subversion through these techniques is attracting a more conservative audience. And when you put that together, you have a very marketable combination across the political spectrum. So the way that you see these techniques is that while these two characters are subverting norms of gender with their superheroism, they're also being white and not impoverished and not transgender and not queer and non-disabled. They also recenter multiple dominant categories. So that really eases that subversion. Second, they're portrayed as being increasingly naturalized to their behavior through their biology, because Wonder Woman is now part Greek god, Captain Marvel is now part Cree, and this kind of it softens their exceptionality. Also, their use of violence is just explained as being natural to them. They're just like others of their violent kind, it's genetic. Third, they're much more frequently now framed as similar to popular male superheroes. So Wonder Woman is more like Superman and Thor, partly in strength, partly in dealing with lightning. Captain Marvel more like Captain America, because they now have rather similar uniforms. They're both called Cap. They won't stay down in a fight. And she's also more like Iron Man too. Partly they both love roady roads, and they're jokey hotheads who fly and shoot energy out of their hands. So even though they're still quantitatively uncommon in the mostly male site of superheroes, they've kind of qualitatively conformed to its dominant visuals. But what I really focus on, not just in this presentation, but also in kind of the larger work from which it stems, is that I think this fourth technique is most powerful, that's easing reception of their militarism while also nodding to feminism, which is constructing their stories as militainment, surrounding them with military aesthetics. Because when you make them female superhero soldiers, they negate arguments that women aren't strong enough for combat, and they kind of espouse these feminist values of care. And they're doing that in places that are constructed as hypermasculine and exclusionary. You know, that's superhero media and real life soldiering. So when you put them in this military milieu, the potential disruption of their female super strength is contained, because they're kind of acting within these hierarchical organizations, and they're usually with their military boyfriends. So this simultaneous feminism and militarism broadens their appeal. So what you tend to see is that they're portrayed with military weapons, military allies who are their significant others and their closest friends. We're not being shown realistic images of death. We're being shown sexy, diverse people and aesthetically pleasing high-tech weaponry. Now, some people receive sort of the empowerment that you see in them in their military work as feminist. But I think we have to be careful with that, because feminism is rooted more in collective power. Whereas here in these stories, it's more about the empowerment of individuals, and it's really not quite the same thing. But I think that the elision between the individual and the collective here is also what's kind of increasing their popularity. The stories also really put a lot of focus on teamwork, teamwork that is geared toward justice for vulnerable people, and particularly with a diverse team who are more like family, like a queer family formation. And with a woman in the team leadership role, formerly dominated by white males, that increases representational equality. But it also normalizes her behavior, because she's kind of acting similar to all these white males that came before her. So her whiteness and cis-heteroness, you know, all these things are sort of recentered. So is her use of force to deal with conflict. So really what I'm getting at is that Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, you know, they're being white and cisgender and non-disabled, their ancestry, their similarities to male characters and their military attachments, contextualizing their violence. This can really ease anxieties among more conservative audiences about there being feminist superwomen, and there being feminist superwomen who work with allies from marginalized groups and who are trying to seek justice for vulnerable people. That can ease anxieties among more progressive audiences about their military violence. So these stories can really be read as progressive and liberatory. They're inclusive, they're nuanced, they emphasize the strength of marginalized groups, but they can also be just as easily read as conservative and post-feminist and post-race, because they also focus on individualized uses of violence against other enemies. And they also tend to rely a bit on white savior tropes. And those focuses can really kind of draw your attention away from more structural inequalities. So it does all this at the same time, and that's what makes them so popular. So.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. All right, Sam, last but not least.
Thank you. So very similar to both what Susan and Carolyn are doing. In a broad sense, the kind of work that I do with superhero comics employs feminist philosophies as a lens through which to do close textual readings of female-led superhero comics in conjunction with discourse analysis of dominant norms of gender, race, and sexuality. So I'm looking to see whether these books adhere to or depart from sort of dominant discourse of identity. I don't believe that representation equals liberation necessarily. But what I am interested in exploring with these types of comics is whether there is any liberatory potential. What can they add to our sort of social imaginary when it comes to more equitable distribution of power, how we understand categories like gender, race, and sexuality, what kinds of ideals these kinds of comics might contribute to in terms of female power, but I mean, I think even more complex than that, just existence. I think that all of that is still very much on the table, and we're still working our way through what it means to have better representation of women, of people of color, of other marginalized communities. I'm specifically with this paper looking at the relationship between violence and feminism, and I kind of come at this from initially a sort of feminist philosophical perspective. So looking at how violence as a concept, but then also the manifestation of real physical violence has been treated by feminist philosophers. And typically what you get is a rejection of violence as being the source of anything good. It has been so thoroughly associated with patriarchy, and because we have staggering numbers to prove that women disproportionately are victims of physical violence in patriarchal cultures. And again, when you start breaking that down, the kinds of violence are overwhelmingly domestic or intimate partner violence. And so it's understandable then from a sort of feminist perspective that violence really isn't going to be a source for empowerment or solidarity or collective liberty. But there have been kind of debates around this. If you kind of leave it at that, there becomes this implication that there's something inherently masculinist about violence, that women are inherently passive and to be acted upon. And it also sort of ignores the reality that women are still subjected to so much physical and ideological violence. And so if we continue to expect that from a feminist perspective, we can't reconceptualize violence in any way, it just sort of means that we leave women in the position of perpetual victimhood. That's the sort of short version of this debate. So what I'm interested in then are two comics, The Unstoppable Wasp and Ironheart, that I have spent some time unpacking and that I have characterized as fairly feminist superhero comics, and looking at physical violence within these books to determine whether that sort of detracts from or can maybe even still be read as contributing to a sort of feminist reading of these texts. And I, of course, because I'm philosophically oriented, don't have an answer. I have more questions. But I think overall, the particular depictions of violence in these books are defensive. And I think that actually makes a sort of qualitative difference when one is trying to think through the relationship between feminism and violence. So what we see with both protagonists is their attempt to deflect situations by many other means before they resort to defensive fighting. they try humor, they try distraction. They may try the sort of like destruction of a building in order to impede, right? But then eventually it gets to a point where it's about protection of self, protection of others. And so in that case, we definitely see these young women fighting aggressively. I'm also really interested in their use of advanced weaponry. Both Nadia and Riri are essentially fighting machines. They are in suits that are nigh unstoppable as long as they're functioning. And so I wonder, again, a little like the kinds of questions that Carolyn has, when we start thinking about advanced weaponry as it often manifests on an industrial level, whether or not the kind of violence that ensues from the use of weapons like that can be thought through in feminist ways. And then I kind of come to the end of my presentation, again, with questions specifically around race when it comes to the Unstoppable Wasp. Nadia Van Dyne is a very charming, cheerful, sweet, and perpetually innocent young white girl. And even when she is in the middle of combat or aggressive defensive fighting or the use of advanced weaponry, she's still happy-go-lucky. And I wonder if that is only palatable and only possible because she is white. And with Riri, she uses surveillance technology in a way that I find kind of worrying. At some point in the Ironheart book, she develops a small kind of GPS tracker that's also got a voice recorder on it, and she surreptitiously plants it on one of her friend's sneakers in order to gather information and data and then to pursue a sort of nemesis. But the friend doesn't know that that's happened, so there's a problem there with consent. And then again, if I'm thinking about how these texts either push back against or reflect our contemporary situation, I think it's necessary for us to ask questions about the ethics of surveillance technology and as it typically can be used to disadvantage and harm particular communities. So I've got questions there again, like if I'm trying to conduct this sort of feminist reading of these texts, what does that sort of seemingly social violence do to the balance? So again, mostly this is still exploratory for me, but it's also indicative of a sort of larger program. And I've said to Carolyn in the past that for me, as someone who does feminist philosophy, I have been trying to think through violence in particular for quite a long time. And so this is a really great opportunity to like apply those questions to a very concrete sort of framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for answering these questions and giving us a little bit of what you have presented on. So what I want to do is while I open up the floor to questions, and again, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A so we can answer them properly. I'm going to get us started with the first question of the night. And I feel like it's kind of an obvious one, but if you guys would be so kind to talk a little bit more about the characters of why you chose to focus on Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman, or Miss Marvel. Why do we choose to focus on these characters and not other ones? Anyone want to go first?
I can go first because my answer might be a little different from the others because of my training. I'm a political scientist and I was trained very quantitatively. And so with both my last book called Superwomen and this one, I was asked what you just asked, which is why these characters, why didn't, for instance, and this is a perfectly reasonable question, why am I focused so much on white characters? Why am I not more focused on the newer characters of color or ones who have been particularly prominent over the years? And the reason is that because of my training, I am always looking for more and more and more and bigger data set. You know, I am trying to have as many points of comparison as possible. So when I did the Superwoman book, I set up the design to basically be both heroes who had been around for a very long time, so I could compare them to themselves over time and show how they changed, and characters who were in more than one medium. So that meant usually comics, TV, and film, and for some of them novels. But that neutral design, which I meant as a social scientist to produce lots of data points so that I would be able to make sort of more, I could make much broader conclusions. Again, this is about training, because in political science, if you have one case, if you have an N of one, then you will be asked, so what? Even if it's super interesting, it's so what? How does this apply to anything else in the world, right? So we're always taught to have more cases. The problem is, in making the more cases for myself, I had produced a design that was not neutral. And the reason it wasn't neutral is because the only heroes that have a very long history and that have been prominent in more than one medium over time are white. So the design kind of reproduces the problem in a way. What it did allow me to do was, again, to talk about trends across media, across time, and across publishers. But it presents a real problem. When I did the new book, it was because of wanting to focus on this idea of militarism, on how militarism and feminism can work, as Sam was kind of suggesting. They can work together in some ways, but they also really work against each other in other ways. It was kind of me coming from the point of view of how much over the years I still enjoy these characters as a fan, but I am increasingly uncomfortable with their violence. But I know other people who are uncomfortable with their feminism and very comfortable with their violence. And so the book started from that. And so the two most prominent characters that had military backgrounds at their origins and were female, and whose creators purposely said at their creation, I'm creating these feminist characters, were these two. There's also quite a bit about their two origin films. And so when I wrote the book, they were the only two who had the only two superhero women who had films, right? So it was that they're both military, they both started as feminist, they both had revised origins in the 20-teens, and they both have an origin film. So that's why. It's not because they're necessarily my favorites or because they would prove the points I was trying to make. That again goes against social science design. In my Superwomen book, I knew that because of the way I designed it, there would be particular comic runs in there that would not lend evidence to what I was trying to say, but that's what you're supposed to do. That's what I was trained to do. I'm sorry that was really long, but I get asked this question a lot. So thank you for indulging me.
No, that's a perfect answer. I like it. Thank you so much for sharing. Susan?
Well, sure. You know, I think I was trained as a rhetorician, so in visual rhetoric and feminist theory. So the academic answer is that I'm drawn to texts that bring up lots of questions, and I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about ethos, I'm thinking about audience, I'm thinking about all of these things. So I like texts that bring up lots of questions for me. And just as during the brief conversation, I've been thinking, oh, I need to think about violence and Ms. Marvel's supersuit and all these other things. So, texts and characters that bring up a lot of questions. So I've written about, Linda Berry, comic strips created by women, and Ms. Marvel. So I'm very interested in this sort of intersection of visual rhetoric and feminist theory. I'm interested in this sort of liminal space of girlhood. I think it's a really interesting moment. And so, of course, Ms. Marvel comes up in that way. But I have to say, selfishly, I like to write and think about things that I enjoy reading as a fan as well. And so, I mean, I just, especially if I'm going to be spending some time with it, I have really been enjoying rereading all of these Ms. Marvel comics and just staring at the minutia and the same with Linda Berry. Like every time I read it, I learn something new, and these other comic strips, it's just, the more I look, the more I see. And so selfishly, as a fan. And sometimes that can also be disheartening, because sometimes I return to texts as a fan and I'm like, oh, that was not as good as I thought it was when I was 12. And so, but that's useful to know as well. So in any case, I would say there's like this academic piece, this scholarly, rigorous piece, but also sort of like a fan piece, you know, that I'm always interested in, is sort of interrogating, what do I like and why do I like it? And maybe I shouldn't, so.
I completely understand, and probably did the same thing with my thesis. So I understand, I'm on that side. Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I will just echo both Carolyn and Susan, excuse me. So I'm really, I have to say, heartened by the number of interviews that I've been seeing as of late, particularly from women in comic studies talking about how they came to it late. It's really nice to see other people out themselves in this way. So similarly, I mean, my brother is 11 years older than I, and so I do remember reading his sort of old Spider-Man comics when I was quite young, but then there was this large gap where I wasn't really reading comics on my own. And it wasn't really until I would say like college, grad school, where I started to get back into it via my own interests, right? Rather than the ones that were dictated to me by what was in the closet. Although I still love Spider-Man, don't get me wrong. But the way that I started out sort of resonates with what happens being a feminist philosopher. You spend a lot of time rooting around through what's wrong. It's a position of critique when you are confronted with a sort of historical body of text that has been overwhelmingly produced by and aimed at a very particular type of person. So my first sort of foray into comic studies was writing about the Dark Phoenix saga from Chris Claremont's run that was originally published, around 1980 or so. And I did that because I was a fan. I loved the character for very personal reasons. And then once I kind of waded into it academically, it's not ruined. I mean, she's a problematic fave. I can keep that in my heart for my own dark reasons. But from a feminist philosophical perspective, this is a disaster of a text. And so, but it was really invigorating insofar as like, I figured out I could do this. I met so many amazing people in comic studies. I got involved with the Comic Studies Society. So for me, again, like I'm going to cherish that experience, but it did make me realize that if I was going to continue to focus on texts and characters that came from the two big publishers and the more traditional sort of storylines and the more famous creators, then I was going to be stuck critiquing endlessly, and that didn't feel very satisfying. I think with feminist philosophy as well, like there are definitely women who work within the historical tradition, and so the bulk of their work is sort of confronting the issues that they find in the canon. That's just not where I'm oriented. I am also interested in the unique ways that women have pushed thinking in other directions based on their own experiences, on their own reflections as women in the world. It's a very creative side to things, and I wanted to do that too with my comic studies. And so for me, I then went looking for female-led characters that were also going to be part of books that at least presented themselves as being progressive to some extent. I was looking for a creative team that, might have been more diverse in terms of its gender makeup, or less so the racial makeup of the creative team. So with those kinds of criteria, because I wanted to read and I wanted to really think through books that were feminist in some sense, it got me to a particular sort of cohort of texts and focusing on certain characters, like Nadia Van Dyne and the Unstoppable Wasp and Riri Williams and Ironheart, they are also part of Marvel's diversity initiative. And again, I think that it's fair for a lot of people to have a lot of questions about the actual intent of that drive that started in the 2010s and the overall impact and effect when so many of those titles have subsequently been canceled. I mean, I think that there's a lot to be said there, but the initial impact of Marvel making this decision that they were going to headhunt a more diverse cast of creators, that they were going to greenlight solo titles that focused on formerly marginalized types of heroes, meant that I had a sort of temporary plethora of books to choose from. And so that's where I got into these particular texts. I mean, I definitely think like Kamala Khan fits this description. Unbeatable Squirrel Girl would fall into that. But the other thing, then you get into like just the practical side of things. So much good work is being done on Miss Marvel. In fact, there's an entire edited volume out now, right? And so I just kind of thought, all right, I'm gonna start trying to focus on the ones that I don't see yet being analyzed as much as Kamala Khan, for instance. And then just what Susan said, like, I just loved these books. I had so much fun reading them. They were very effective for me in various ways, and I couldn't not talk about them. So I thought I might as well put that to good use.
Fantastic answers. Thank you guys so much. All right, so we're gonna go to our Q&A. This one is mostly for Sam and Carolyn. Okay, so both of your papers look at the role of violence and its implication for feminist readings of women superheroes. But there's a question from John saying, I'm wondering where a character like She-Hulk or X-23 with their more primal, instinctual form of violence might fit within a feminist reading. So is like their status as mutations or experiments a way of distancing the readers from types of violence? And that's, if that can make sense. And you can also talk about, if you're familiar with Black Werewolf, or how might revenge violence fit within the feminist schema? So whoever wants to go first.
So the first thing that kind of occurred to me, it's a little difficult for me to think about the relationship between feminism and violence with reference to She-Hulk and X-23 in particular, because of the sort of androcentric history of the creation of these characters. In each case, because they are, at least originally, right, we're literally just like the girl version of boy characters. That sort of throws a stumbling block in my thinking, because it gets me back to one of the theorists that I reference in this paper, is Martha McCaughey, and she raises the point, right, that we have not sufficiently troubled the assumption that there is an inherent link between masculinity and violence. And if one is not being generous enough in reading She-Hulk and X-23, and you do believe that they are sort of androcentric shadows of boys, then their violence just becomes another result of masculinity. It just kind of doubles down on that problematic assumption of the inherent link. That's where I've gotten with that so far. I don't know if that's, if, like I said, maybe I'm not being generous, right? And I'm not thinking through more contemporary iterations of these characters. But that's what came to my mind immediately, was more of like the origins, and therefore my car stopped on the road, right?
To take up what Sam was saying about the the girl versions of boy characters, it's kind of what I have been seeing with Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel in the 20 teens, as they're made increasingly similar to pre-existing popular male characters. I feel like that same kind of work is being done, where it's sort of like easing their palatability and helping them to become more popular, just, you know, masculinizing them, their behavior, but in a pretty body. The other thing that I would say about those two in particular is that it also kind of conforms to the other, one of the other things I was saying about Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, which is that other changes to them in the 20 teens have meant changes in their origins. And so now Wonder Woman is this demigod daughter of Zeus, who I think we can all agree is, you know, the dirtbag of the gods, right? He's awful and he's violent and he does terrible things. And then Captain Marvel is now the daughter of a Kree warrior who says to her daughter, what other people see as powers are just our Kree biological adaptations to a life of combat. So what I'm getting at is that both of these women's violence is explained as just being natural to them, as being inherent to them. And I think you can kind of make that argument about She-Hulk and Laura also, in that what their bodies have gone through means that violence is natural to them. Part of it is the comparison to the male superhero that they're kind of the offshoot of, even though they're both great characters. I mean, I love both of them. But that is how they started. So I think part of it is that, and part of it is this sort of, you know, they can't help it. It's natural to them. It's biological to them, right? So that kind of explains away this subversive choice to use violence in a female body, which granted, as Sam said, doesn't necessarily have to be categorized as subversive because there's no necessary reason that violence has to be a male trait. I mean, if you look, I talk more about this in my larger project, but if you look around the world at revolutionary movements, you see that women have been and still remain involved in revolutionary movements around the world, have been the core of using the kinds of anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist modes of violence that maybe in some cases, as Sam pointed me to talk about in that project, to think about fentanyl, that sometimes that is your only recourse. Walking up to your colonizer and telling them that they're wrong and you're human tends not to work. So this is not to say that I'm advocating violence as a first resort. I'm certainly not. But there is a way of decoupling it from masculinity, for sure.
I will just quickly add, I have not read Diary of a Mad Black Werewolf, although I'd love to. But the idea, again, thinking specifically about revenge violence, and in that case, we're also dealing specifically with Black women and the violence that they experience, and then the sort of reactions that could happen. It also made me think of Juke Joint, which is an incredibly violent comic. It's gorgeous, but the premise is entirely around a sort of commune of women, I'll just leave it at that, who go after the perpetrators of interpersonal and sexualized violence and teach them what's what in various graphic ways. And for me, this is where it starts to become really interesting. I think, like, when we consider the sort of overlapping systems of oppression under which we are living, and the immense amount of violence that actually manifests, and disproportionately for Black women in particular. I think it's unreasonable then to expect that, again, like I said at the beginning, that violence isn't going to be part of the equation. Like, as long as the framework of the story is violent, I don't really think it's reasonable to suggest that the characters are not going to respond in kind. What we really wanted, like a higher body count. I don't think that's what we're aiming for. It's interesting to me to think about one of the things that Carolyn has said about really enjoying violence in certain scenarios. And I will say that I'm a sucker for revenge violence. And I have not had a chance to think through that critically. And that's, again, like where I'm at. I can't quite work out, like, that could just be a personal tell. But what does that mean? And that I think I realize that becomes a bit more difficult for me then to kind of critically engage with whether revenge violence can or is feminist, because I start to just think, well, I'm just fangirling over this. Like there's not anything complicated going on. But I still just think, like, as long as the story being told includes violence, I'm not going to ask my women characters to just lay down and take it.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to throw a question for Susan. Does the movement from girlhood to womanhood necessarily involve integrating rage or violent impulses into the adult personality? And if so, in what ways? Are there productive or justified forms of violence that don't stand in opposition to the principles of goodness and mercy?
I think it's a really great question. I think it's a very big question when we think about girlhood and violence, because immediately I start thinking about movies, about The Final Girl, about all of these different genres, and even within comics. So it's a really big question, which would be a great book, maybe. But I think I can maybe speak a little bit to Ms. Marvel, because I think that Ms. Marvel has struggled with violence. She's spoken about it throughout both the original series and the Magnificent Ms. Marvel. And that's something that as a reader, I enjoyed reading, is her sort of struggling and puzzling through her feelings about it. There's a scene where she's talking to Wolverine at one point, and she's really upset about hurting an alligator. And I think it's really interesting because she feels really bad and she doesn't want to hurt it. And Wolverine's like, it's an alligator, come on. And then there's other cases where she is forced to confront the fact that she's fought with someone and they're hurt, and she feels terrible about it. So it's interesting to watch Ms. Marvel struggle with her feelings about violence, which I think is really interesting to watch her struggle with it explicitly. In this particular example with Storm Ranger, I find it fascinating because Ms. Marvel has acquired this Kree Storm Ranger nanosuit, as one does. So, she's fighting on an alien planet, and this sentient, sorry, I have to back up a little bit, but, this sentient suit chooses her. So she gets this really cool costume, and it's like a sentient AI nanosuit. And she brings it back to Earth. And there's this pivotal moment where Ms. Marvel is fighting with Mr. Hyde, and she can't stop beating him. And she realizes, this is not me. This is, and it's interesting because we're talking about violence. This is, sort of unjustified. There is no mercy in this. She's just beating him. And there's this really kind of violent moment where she rips off the suit, and the suit becomes an entirely different sentient character, Storm Ranger. And it's fascinating because it's like Ms. Marvel cannot coexist with this type of violence. And it does, it is interesting with Venom, but it's like Ms. Marvel as a character cannot coexist or inhabit this kind of violence. And it's interesting too, because once they split, Storm Ranger looks much older. She is more of a woman. She is more adult. And Ms. Marvel looks kind of small, and she doesn't have her suit, and she's wearing like a t-shirt. And just in the way that panels are presented on these pages, it's like Storm Ranger, this woman, a womanly woman, she's up there, she's looming over Ms. Marvel, who has been stripped of her costume. She's very vulnerable and very small. And it's interesting to me to think about, I can't speak to the larger issues as such, but for Ms. Marvel, it seems like she, as a girl, as a teen, cannot, at least for her, coexist with that kind of violence. And so it is stripped away from her, and it becomes its own entity, a woman who has this, she's violence without mercy. She is logic. And there's other interesting things that we could talk about too, about, depictions of cyborgs and our relationship to technology as well. So there's all, as I said, I love texts that bring up lots of questions, but in this case, it feels like Ms. Marvel, this girl, cannot coexist with that kind of violence and has to physically remove it, at which point it becomes a whole other thing. So that's a long sort of answer. But, and again, as Sam was saying, it just brings up all these other questions, which I think are really interesting to think through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right, we have another question from Jeannie, who would like to hear more about the character's racial identity, how it shapes our thinking about violence and fighting in comparative sense. So in what ways are the characters of color and or the readers aware of the racialization of women's strengths? Is this a broader range of violent action available to white characters?
I just wanted to jump in. Sam mentioned there's a great anthology about Ms. Marvel, and there's an interview in there in which Willow Wilson talks about creating the character of Ms. Marvel and saying that they chose very specifically her polymorph powers, and they wanted to have certain powers because they didn't want for a character of color, they wanted to be very specific. They didn't want a super violent power. They were like, and again, I'm paraphrasing this great interview, which I encourage you all to check out, this wonderful anthology. But Wilson was saying we had to be careful. You know, there was a certain range of powers. We didn't want her to be too violent because of the ways in which that would be read. And so they chose very specifically these, you know, the power to shape change and be this polymorph. It's very interesting. So I think there is they chose very specifically from a limited range of powers. On the other hand, you know, Ms. Marvel has evolved to become, she's usually using these polymorph powers with her giant fists to like pound on people. So it's interesting to see the intention and where it has gone. But there's a really interesting, interview where Wilson talks a little bit about that issue.
I would say that I think that is one of the things that I do strongly suspect, like I mentioned specifically with Nadia, that she's allowed to have a dance party while she's kicking butt is like, it's so cute. But yeah, I don't know. The thing with Riri that I think is really important is that kind of early fan reactions to her were underlaced with a lot of misogynoir. There were heavy implications that she was a sort of sociopath, that she was very unlikable. Some of the early Bendis storylines had her sort of participating in the prison industrial complex, which is like a little worrying. But I think what I really like about the Ironheart book that Eve Ewing is the writer on, she is a defender. She fights aggressively when she must defend herself or others. But I think it would be very difficult for anyone to read that book and come to the conclusion that she's doing that because she's inherently aggressive or enraged, which of course is the misogynoirist assumption about Black women, that they are sort of unavoidably angry and aggressive. And I think this book does a really good job of sort of making that reading completely unsustainable. And the other thing, of course, that goes on throughout this book is that Riri is kind of constantly having this conversation with herself and consequently with Nadia about Arendtian ethics, right? Like, what does it mean to be evil? And she asks herself a lot, am I bad? Am I inherently bad? And the creators do a great job of bringing that full circle, right? One, that kind of debate happens communally, that they have to all collaborate in order to really think about what good and evil look like and what might constitute bad action. I really like it from a feminist perspective because there's a lot of demonstration of agency there, right? This idea that women can act with intention. And Riri eventually comes to realize that things are complicated. The world is complicated and you can choose to do the right thing, but it is a requirement that you choose and you actively pursue to do the right thing. You cannot passively expect that you're going to just be good or evil, and if you do, you're kind of going to wind up on the evil side of things. So all of that is to say that I think that the combination of all of that, like I said, not only makes a racist, sexist reading of Riri's violence unsustainable, but actively disrupts it. And I think that's really invigorating and promising. Right, Jeannie, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the book demonstrates that when she's fighting, it's for a reason. There isn't the assumption that it's irrational anger or aggression, but justifiable.
Yeah. No. Carolyn, any thoughts on this as well?
I could, but they both did a really good job. And I'm looking at the time. So if you want to get to other people's questions, I won't weigh in on this one.
Well, feel free to, because we're just going to do one more question. And so we have a ton of questions, but feel free to go ahead and answer this one as well.
No, I guess if I were to be very quick, I would just say that I have often tried to think about if Captain Marvel in particular, because there, I would say if I were to draw sort of a parallel between her and Nadia, it's sort of like the jokey, fun, I'm now going to punch somebody kind of thing, right? And Captain Marvel does a lot of that. So because of misogynoir, what would it look like if Captain Marvel were very dark-skinned and had natural hair? You know, how would she be received? Not only by other characters, but how would she be received by readers, even if she were doing exactly the same thing? And in my presentation, I mentioned a quote. This is basically what Sam was saying, but I was a quote from Tongue where she says, a fierce, kick-ass Black woman is more likely read as hyper-aggressive, wild, untamable, and vicious, rather than as an admirable warrior woman breaking down age-old stereotypes that white women invoke. And unfortunately, we still have quite a bit of that. And I think that's translatable to Latinas as well, in particular.
Good point. All right. Well, we're going to have to wrap this up, and we have several good questions remaining, but we wanted to ask you three if you actually had questions for each other. Reverse questions. Anybody want to give it a go? Or take a moment of pause?
I will just quickly say that I'm really excited about both of these papers, and there are elements that I find really intriguing that I'm like really looking forward to hearing more about. Certainly with Susan's paper, this idea of liminality and girlhood and the sort of weight of womanhood as being a sort of violent end to that liminal stage is like, yeah, there's something sparkly going on there, and I want you to talk to me about it because I can't quite make sense of it. I love Carolyn's work, and I'm not going to say that I don't have questions or thoughts, but because I have seen it, and I've seen it several times through its development, she kind of already knows what questions arose for me. And so we've had that conversation. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I will just say, like, I'm such a fan, and I learn so much from everything that she does. So.
Yeah, I think I would echo Sam in that I'm a big fan of my co-panelists' work. And for me, this process has been wonderful because it's given me so much, as you pointed out, to think about in terms of, I really want to dig in and think about violence inspired by your work, both of you, thinking about violence in Ms. Marvel. Because I want to look at the first series and the second series. I want to look at Storm Ranger. I want to think about how violence is portrayed and at this sort of liminal space, girl and woman. Is it, as you say, an ultimate end that to be avoided? It's just been really inspiring to me to think about that in different ways. So I'm very grateful for this process and these presentations because it's given me a lot of questions to think through. So I'm the kind of person who thinks of smart questions later. So I'll probably be bothering my fellow panelists later, like, what do you think about this? So I just wanted to say that it's been very inspiring. So thank you.
okay, it's not fair for me to try to go last for this after that, but I would join the Love Fest and say that it is true that Sam saw multiple drafts of the larger version of what I've been talking about, and she absolutely made it better. And that's why we have to read and cite and invite. And we have to make sure that we all talk to each other and form community and support each other in solidarity with the work that we're doing. But without having a specific question, I can tell you 110% that I, unfortunately, because of my schedule, did the final version of my presentation before Sam and Susan. And the reason that was unfortunate is because I got them to see mine, and then I saw theirs and said, oh, right. You know, like they were saying all these things that I wish that I had, of course, thought of myself before I had, you know, put my own work together. So I absolutely learned a lot from both of them. And I was so glad that I had, you know, not only their pictures, but their transcripts, because now I can go back and refer to them as well. So these two women are a real resource. And so I hope everyone out there knows that and reads and cites and invites them.
Wonderful way to end this. Can I just say that? And I very much appreciate all of you for saying that. I know that we do have some questions left over. So if anybody feels a need, feel free to go to Twitter and use our hashtag ICAF virtual. And hopefully we can get some of our panelists to answer them via Twitter or on the interwebs. But again, this has been a wonderful panel, and I just want to close out. Thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks again to our panelists for sharing their ideas and research throughout the night. And of course, please check the rest of our virtual panel series on the ICAF website at internationalcomicsartforum.org, and you can even look at the chat. Thank you so much, Frank, for putting it in the chat. Our next roundtable will take place on December 3rd and will be entitled Representation, Reparation, and Renovation. We hope to see you there, and thank you again.